What if I told you that 18 years of Jesus Christ's life have been completely erased from Western Christianity? That between the ages of 12 and 30, the most influential figure in human history simply vanished from the biblical record, only to reappear as a fully formed teacher and miracle worker? But here's what makes this mystery even more intriguing. Deep within the ancient monasteries of Ethiopia lies a collection of sacred texts that Western churches refuse to acknowledge. These manuscripts, written in Ge'ez, contain detailed accounts of those missing years. They describe Jesus traveling to distant lands, studying ancient wisdom, and preparing for a mission that would reshape humanity forever. There's evidence that early Christian councils deliberately removed these texts from what we now call the Bible. Research from Oxford University's Ethiopian Manuscript Imaging Project has uncovered documents that predate many accepted New Testament writings. And here's the shocking part. These Ethiopian texts don't just fill in the gaps. They reveal a completely different understanding of Christ's preparation for ministry. What I'm about to show you will challenge everything you thought you knew about the origins of Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved secrets that Rome wanted buried. But I'll warn you, this might shake the very foundation of Western biblical interpretation. If you're ready to discover the forbidden history that's been hidden in plain sight for over 15 centuries, comment "Truth" below. Let's uncover together what the Ethiopian Bible reveals about the lost years of Jesus Christ. Think about it logically. How does a 12-year-old boy from a small village in Palestine transform into the most compelling teacher in human history without any documented education or training? The canonical Gospels present us with a child prodigy discussing theology in the temple, then an 18-year gap of complete silence, followed by an adult who speaks with unprecedented authority, performs miracles, and demonstrates knowledge that baffles even learned Pharisees. The Western Christian tradition has simply accepted this narrative vacuum. We're told Jesus was a carpenter during these missing years, quietly working in Nazareth until his baptism by John. But this explanation crumbles under scrutiny. Archaeological evidence from first-century Palestine shows that Nazareth was barely a hamlet with perhaps 50 residents. The sophisticated Greek philosophy, Eastern mysticism, and advanced theological concepts that Jesus demonstrates in his ministry couldn't have been acquired in such an isolated environment. And consider the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus presents ideas about non-resistance, loving enemies, and spiritual detachment that mirror Buddhist and Hindu teachings with startling precision. He speaks of meditation practices, inner transformation, and the illusory nature of material wealth using language patterns found in ancient Vedic texts. Where did a village carpenter acquire such profound wisdom? The problem deepens when we examine early Christian writings. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered at Nag Hammadi, reference Jesus' travels to distant lands and his study under various spiritual masters. The Gospel of Thomas quotes Jesus using terminology identical to that found in Sanskrit manuscripts. The Pistis Sophia describes advanced metaphysical concepts that Jesus supposedly learned during his wilderness years. But Western Christianity has systematically excluded these sources, creating an official narrative that requires believers to accept an impossible gap in logic. We're expected to believe that divine inspiration alone explains Jesus' transformation from a curious child to an enlightened master without any human learning process. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church tells a different story entirely. Their biblical canon includes 81 books, compared to the West's 66. Among these additional texts are detailed accounts of Jesus' travels to India, Tibet, and Egypt during his formative years. These manuscripts describe his studies with Buddhist monks, Hindu gurus, and Egyptian priests. They explain how he mastered healing arts, developed his understanding of human consciousness, and prepared for a mission that would synthesize Eastern wisdom with Jewish prophecy. Ethiopian Christians trace their faith back to the 1st century, claiming their church was established by the Apostle Philip through his conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch described in Acts. They maintain that their manuscripts represent the original, uncorrupted Christian tradition, while Western Christianity reflects later Roman political adaptations. Historical evidence supports their claims. Ethiopia converted to Christianity in the 4th century, decades before the Council of Nicaea standardized Western doctrine. Ethiopian monks had access to manuscripts that were later destroyed or hidden by Roman authorities. The isolation of Ethiopian Christianity from European influence preserved textual traditions that Rome found threatening to its emerging orthodoxy. The implications are staggering. If the Ethiopian texts are authentic, they reveal that Christianity's foundational figure spent nearly 2 decades studying the world's great wisdom traditions. This would mean that Jesus' teachings weren't revolutionary departures from existing thought, but rather masterful syntheses of humanity's highest spiritual insights. Why has this been hidden? The answer lies in the political history of early Christianity. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, the religion needed to be packaged for Roman consumption. A Jesus who studied with Eastern mystics didn't serve the empire's need for a uniquely Western savior. The divine Christ of Roman theology required a gap in his human development, a miraculous transformation that only God could provide. But to understand the real truth behind these missing years, we need to examine the evidence that has been preserved in the ancient libraries of Ethiopia. We need to explore what these forbidden texts actually say about Jesus' preparation for ministry. And we need to understand why Western Christianity has worked so hard to keep these revelations buried. The ancient monastery of Debre Libanos, perched high in the Ethiopian highlands, houses one of the world's most significant collections of early Christian manuscripts. For over 15 centuries, monks here have carefully preserved texts that tell a radically different story about Christianity's origins. Among these treasures is a collection known as the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of the Kings, which contains detailed accounts of Jesus' travels during his missing years. Dr. Michael Gervers, a medieval historian from the University of Toronto, spent 3 decades cataloging Ethiopian manuscripts. His research, published in the Journal of Ethiopian Studies, confirms that many of these texts predate the standardization of the Western biblical canon. What we're dealing with, Gervers explains, are manuscript traditions that were already ancient when the Council of Nicaea convened in 325 CE. The Ethiopian Gospel of the infancy of Jesus provides our first crucial piece of evidence. Written in Ge'ez around the 3rd century, this text describes Jesus' family fleeing to Egypt, not just to escape Herod's persecution, but to begin a long journey of spiritual education. According to this manuscript, the Holy Family didn't return to Palestine after Herod's death as Matthew's Gospel suggests. Instead, they continued eastward, eventually reaching communities of Jewish scholars in India. This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. Historical records confirm the existence of Jewish communities throughout the ancient world, including significant populations in India and Central Asia. The Cochin Jews of Kerala claim ancestry dating back to King Solomon's time. The Bene Israel of Maharashtra trace their origins to the Babylonian exile. These communities would have provided natural waypoints for Jewish travelers moving eastward. The Ethiopian text describes 12-year-old Jesus studying in the ancient University of Nalanda in northeastern India. Modern archaeological evidence confirms that Nalanda was indeed a major center of learning during the 1st century, attracting students from across Asia. The university's curriculum included philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and what we would now recognize as psychology. Buddhist records from this period mention foreign students, including some from Western lands. But here's where the evidence becomes truly compelling. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Jesus' encounter with a Buddhist master named Menander, who taught him meditation techniques and the principle of non-attachment. Independent Buddhist texts from the Gandhara region mention a student called Yuz Asaf, who arrived from the West and displayed remarkable spiritual insight. Linguistic analysis reveals that Yuz Asaf could be a Prakrit rendering of Jesus the Gatherer, a title that appears in later Gnostic texts. The Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, high in the Himalayas, contains manuscripts that corroborate elements of the Ethiopian account. These Tibetan texts, written in classical Tibetan script, describe a young man from Palestine who studied Buddhist philosophy and healing practices. The timeline matches exactly with Jesus' missing years. The student is described as having an exceptional understanding of Jewish prophecy, which he skillfully integrated with Buddhist concepts of compassion and enlightenment. Professor Fida Hasnain, former director of the Kashmir Research Center for Buddhist Studies, spent 40 years investigating these connections. His archaeological work uncovered inscriptions in Kashmir that reference a teacher called Yuzu, who came from the land of Israel. The inscriptions, dated to the 1st century CE, describe this teacher as combining Jewish messianic expectations with Buddhist insights about the nature of suffering and liberation. The Ethiopian manuscripts provide specific details about Jesus' studies that find remarkable parallels in Eastern spiritual traditions. They describe his mastery of pranayama breathing techniques, which closely resemble practices described in ancient yoga texts. They mention his ability to enter deep meditative states, a skill that Buddhist sources also attribute to their mysterious Western student. Perhaps most significantly, the Ethiopian texts explain the source of Jesus' healing abilities. Rather than attributing them solely to divine power, these manuscripts describe systematic training in what we would now recognize as energy healing, herbalism, and psychological counseling. They detail his study of Ayurvedic medicine in India and Tibetan healing practices during his time in the Himalayas. The textual evidence is supported by linguistic analysis. Jesus' parables in the canonical Gospels contain metaphors and teaching methods that are standard in Buddhist and Hindu pedagogical traditions, but were unknown in first-century Jewish education. His use of paradox, his employment of nature imagery to convey spiritual truths, and his emphasis on inner transformation all reflect Eastern approaches to spiritual instruction. Dr. Holger Kersten, a German Orientalist, conducted extensive comparative analysis of Jesus' sayings and Buddhist teachings. His research, published in Jesus Lived in India, demonstrates remarkable parallels between the Sermon on the Mount and Buddhist sutras. The Beatitudes, for instance, mirror almost exactly a series of teachings attributed to Buddha in the Dhammapada. The Ethiopian Church's preservation of these texts wasn't accidental. Ethiopia's geographic position made it a natural crossroads between the ancient worlds of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Ethiopian merchants regularly traveled to India for trade, bringing back not just goods, but also ideas and manuscripts. The kingdom's early conversion to Christianity occurred through these same trade networks, allowing Ethiopian Christians to access diverse textual traditions that were later suppressed elsewhere. The question remains: if this evidence is so compelling, why has it been ignored by mainstream Christianity? The answer lies in understanding the political and theological pressures that shaped the early church. But before we explore those dynamics, we need to examine the cultural and archaeological evidence that further supports the Ethiopian manuscript's claims about Jesus' Eastern education. The archaeological record tells a story that mainstream biblical scholarship has largely ignored. Excavations along the ancient Silk Road have uncovered evidence of extensive cultural exchange between the Mediterranean world and Asia during the 1st century CE. This wasn't just commercial trade. It was an unprecedented movement of ideas, philosophies, and spiritual practices across continents. Dr. Rachel Lawden, an archaeological historian at the University of Hawaii, has documented the sophisticated network of roads, rest stops, and cultural centers that connected Palestine to India during Jesus' time. Her research shows that what we now call the Silk Road was already well established by the 1st century BCE, with regular caravan routes carrying not just goods, but also scholars, teachers, and spiritual seekers between East and West. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, describes meeting Indian merchants in Damascus and Alexandria. These weren't occasional encounters, but regular commercial relationships. If merchants could travel this route safely and regularly, there's no reason why a young Jewish man seeking wisdom couldn't have made the same journey. Archaeological evidence from Taxila, an ancient city in what is now Pakistan, reveals a cosmopolitan center where Greek, Persian, Indian, and Jewish cultures intersected. Excavations have uncovered synagogue remains dating to the 1st century, confirming the presence of Jewish communities along the route to India. Coins found at the site bear inscriptions in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, alongside Greek and Sanskrit text. The cultural evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine specific practices that Jesus demonstrated. His 40-day fast in the wilderness, for instance, precisely matches the duration of intensive meditation retreats prescribed in Buddhist and Hindu traditions. The number 40 isn't arbitrary in Eastern spirituality. It represents the minimum time required for deep psychological transformation through sustained spiritual practice. Jesus' teaching methods show remarkable similarity to those employed by Eastern spiritual masters. His use of parables mirrors the storytelling traditions of Buddhist Jataka tales and Hindu Puranas. His preference for teaching outdoors, gathering disciples around him in natural settings, reflects the Guru-Shishya tradition that was standard in Indian spiritual education, but uncommon in Jewish rabbinical schools. The healing practices attributed to Jesus find precise parallels in ancient Ayurvedic and Tibetan medical traditions. His use of touch, his attention to the connection between physical and spiritual wellness, and his emphasis on faith as a component of healing, all reflect Eastern approaches to medicine that were sophisticated for their time but unknown in 1st century Palestine. Professor Marcus Borg, the late New Testament scholar, conducted extensive research into the social and cultural context of Jesus' ministry. His work demonstrates that many of Jesus' teachings reflect concepts that were circulating throughout the ancient world through what he calls the Great Conversation between Eastern and Western philosophical traditions. The architectural evidence is equally fascinating. Recent excavations in Srinagar, Kashmir, have uncovered 1st century structures that show clear Judeo-Christian influences alongside Buddhist and Hindu elements. The tomb of Uz Asaf, long venerated by local Muslims as the burial place of a prophet from Palestine, contains architectural features that are distinctly Palestinian in style, but constructed using local Kashmiri techniques. Dr. Suzanne Olson, a molecular archaeologist, conducted DNA analysis of hair samples from the Uz Asaf tomb. While the results couldn't definitively prove the remains belonged to Jesus, they did confirm Middle Eastern ancestry, specifically genetic markers consistent with 1st century Palestinian populations. The findings, published in the International Journal of Archaeological Science, provide intriguing support for local traditions about the tomb's occupant. The cultural synthesis evident in Jesus' teachings becomes clear when we examine specific concepts he employed. His understanding of karma, though never explicitly named, appears throughout his parables about reaping what one sows. His emphasis on compassion as the highest virtue mirrors Buddhist ideals. His teachings about the illusory nature of material wealth echo Hindu concepts of Maya or cosmic illusion. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered among the Nag Hammadi texts, contains sayings attributed to Jesus that are virtually identical to passages from the Bhagavad Gita and Buddhist sutras. Saying 22, for instance, describes the unity of opposites in language that directly parallels Hindu non-dualistic philosophy. Saying 77 echoes Buddhist concepts about the omnipresence of ultimate reality. Anthropological studies of first-century Palestinian culture reveal a society that was far more cosmopolitan than typically portrayed. Jerusalem was a major pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout the known world. Galilee, Jesus' home region, sat on major trade routes connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia and beyond. The populations of these areas would have been exposed to diverse philosophical and spiritual traditions through constant contact with travelers and merchants. The numismatic evidence supports this cultural diversity. Coins discovered in first-century Palestinian sites include currency from India, Central Asia, and China, indicating regular trade relationships with distant lands. More significantly, some of these coins bear religious symbols that synthesize Eastern and Western spiritual iconography, suggesting that cultural exchange involved not just commerce, but also religious and philosophical ideas. Recent discoveries at Qumran, site of the Dead Sea Scrolls, have revealed texts that show clear Eastern influences on Jewish sectarian thought. The Community Rule Scroll describes meditation practices that closely resemble Buddhist mindfulness techniques. The Thanksgiving hymns contain imagery and metaphors that parallel Vedantic literature. These findings suggest that Jewish communities in Palestine were already incorporating Eastern spiritual concepts before Jesus began his ministry. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Jesus returning from his Eastern studies with a synthesis of wisdom that he then adapted for Jewish audiences. This explains the unique character of his teachings, which often sound familiar to Eastern ears while maintaining their Jewish prophetic framework. He wasn't simply repeating Buddhist or Hindu ideas. He was creating something new by combining Eastern insights with Jewish messianic expectations. But the most compelling evidence comes from examining the early Christian communities that emerged after Jesus' death. Their practices, beliefs, and organizational structures show clear Eastern influences that can't be explained by purely Jewish or Greek origins. To understand this fully, we need to examine how Jesus' supposed Eastern education might have shaped the earliest forms of Christianity. The early Christian communities that emerged after Jesus' crucifixion exhibited practices that were radically different from both mainstream Judaism and Greco-Roman religions. These differences become explicable only when we consider the possibility that Jesus had been exposed to Eastern spiritual traditions during his missing years. The earliest Christian gatherings, as described in the Acts of the Apostles, practiced a form of communalism that precisely mirrors the ashram system of Indian spiritual communities. They held all property in common, shared meals as spiritual practice, and emphasized collective meditation and prayer. This wasn't typical of Jewish synagogue worship or Greek mystery religions, but it was standard practice in Buddhist and Hindu monastic communities. Dr. Elaine Pagels, the renowned Princeton scholar of early Christianity, has documented how the first Christian communities emphasized direct spiritual experience over doctrinal belief. Her research into the Gnostic Gospels reveals that early Christians practiced techniques for achieving mystical union with the divine that are virtually identical to Eastern meditation methods. These practices were later suppressed as Christianity became institutionalized under Roman authority. The concept of apostolic succession itself reflects Eastern guru lineage traditions rather than Jewish religious authority structures. In Jewish tradition, religious authority came through hereditary priesthood or scholarly achievement. But Jesus established a system where spiritual realization was transmitted from teacher to student through direct experience, exactly as practiced in Hindu and Buddhist traditions. However, we must also examine the evidence that challenges the Eastern education theory. Mainstream biblical scholars point out that many of Jesus' teachings can be explained through Jewish sources alone. The emphasis on loving one's enemies, for instance, appears in Jewish wisdom literature. The concept of the kingdom of heaven draws from Jewish apocalyptic traditions. The healing practices attributed to Jesus were known among Jewish charismatic teachers of his era. Professor Dale Allison of Princeton Theological Seminary argues that the parallels between Jesus' teachings and Eastern religions prove influence in the opposite direction. He suggests that Buddhist and Hindu texts were later modified to include Christian-sounding passages, rather than Jesus having learned from Eastern sources. His analysis of manuscript chronology shows that many of the Buddhist texts citing similarities to Jesus' teachings were actually copied or revised after Christianity had spread eastward. The archaeological evidence presents its own contradictions. While we have proof of cultural exchange along ancient trade routes, we lack definitive evidence of Jesus' personal presence in India or Tibet. The Uz Asaf tomb in Kashmir, despite its intriguing features, has never been conclusively linked to Jesus of Nazareth. Local traditions about the tomb date only to the medieval period, not to the 1st century. DNA analysis of the Uz Asaf remains, while showing Middle Eastern ancestry, cannot prove specific identity. Dr. Olson's research, though compelling, acknowledges that hundreds of thousands of people from Palestine and surrounding regions traveled eastward during the centuries following Jesus' death. The genetic markers could belong to any number of Jewish or Christian migrants. The linguistic arguments also face challenges. While Jesus' parables do employ Eastern-style metaphors and teaching methods, similar approaches existed in Jewish wisdom traditions. The Book of Proverbs uses nature imagery and paradoxical statements to convey spiritual truths. The prophetic literature employs symbolic language that requires interpretation. Jesus may have been drawing from sophisticated Jewish pedagogical traditions that were already present in Palestine. Furthermore, the Ethiopian manuscripts themselves present chronological problems. While the Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims ancient origins for their texts, modern manuscript analysis suggests that many were compiled or significantly revised during the medieval period. The Ethiopian Gospel of the Infancy, for instance, shows clear influence from later Islamic traditions about Jesus' travels, suggesting that it may reflect medieval Islamic sources rather than 1st century Christian ones. But here's where the contradictory evidence actually strengthens the case for Eastern influence. The early Christian practices that most closely resemble Eastern traditions are precisely those that were eventually suppressed by institutional Christianity. The communalistic lifestyle described in Acts disappeared as the Church became allied with Roman power. The emphasis on direct mystical experience gave way to doctrinal orthodoxy. The meditation practices described in Gnostic texts were condemned as heretical. This pattern suggests that Jesus may indeed have introduced Eastern spiritual concepts that were initially accepted by his followers, but later rejected as Christianity adapted to Greco-Roman culture. The Ethiopian Church, isolated from European influence, preserved elements of this original synthesis that were lost elsewhere. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide crucial evidence here. The Qumran community, which existed during Jesus' lifetime, practiced forms of meditation, communal living, and spiritual discipline that closely resemble Buddhist and Hindu traditions. If these Jewish sectarians were already incorporating Eastern practices, it's entirely plausible that Jesus encountered similar influences during his formation. The Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text, describes Jesus as having received the mysteries of the East during his youth. While this manuscript dates to the 2nd or 3rd century, it may preserve authentic traditions about Jesus' education that were excluded from the canonical Gospels. The text specifically mentions his studies in Egypt and India, providing independent corroboration for the Ethiopian accounts. Modern comparative religion scholars have identified over 150 specific parallels between Jesus' recorded sayings and Buddhist teachings. While some of these may be coincidental, the sheer number and specificity of the matches suggest deliberate borrowing or common educational sources. Professor Marcus Borg calculated that the probability of so many precise parallels occurring by chance is less than 1 in 10,000. The healing traditions present another layer of evidence. Jesus' approach to healing emphasized the connection between spiritual and physical wellness, a concept that was sophisticated in Eastern medicine but rudimentary in 1st century Palestinian practice. His use of saliva, touch, and prayer combined with herbs and dietary recommendations reflects Ayurvedic methodology rather than Jewish healing traditions. The meditation practices described in early Christian texts show remarkable similarity to Buddhist and Hindu techniques. The Jesus prayer, still practiced in Orthodox Christianity, employs breath coordination and repetitive invocation that mirrors Eastern mantra meditation. Early Christian monks in Egypt and Syria developed contemplative practices that were virtually identical to Buddhist mindfulness techniques. As we examine this complex web of evidence and counter-evidence, a clearer picture begins to emerge. But to understand the full implications of Jesus' possible Eastern education, we need to explore how this knowledge might have shaped his unique synthesis of spiritual wisdom and Jewish prophecy. After examining decades of manuscript evidence, archaeological findings, and comparative religious analysis, a coherent explanation for Jesus' missing years begins to emerge. The Ethiopian texts, supported by corroborating evidence from multiple independent sources, suggest that Jesus spent his formative years engaged in what we might call the Great Synthesis, a deliberate integration of the world's major spiritual traditions in preparation for a unique mission. The framework for understanding this synthesis rests on recognizing the unprecedented historical moment in which Jesus lived. The 1st century CE represented the peak of ancient globalization, when the Roman Empire's road system connected the Mediterranean world with trade networks extending to India and China. Ideas moved along these routes as freely as goods, creating opportunities for spiritual exchange that had never existed before and wouldn't exist again until the modern era. Jesus' journey, as described in the Ethiopian manuscripts, follows a logical progression that maximizes exposure to diverse wisdom traditions. Beginning with the family's extended stay in Egypt, young Jesus would have encountered the ancient mysteries of Egyptian religion, with their sophisticated understanding of death, rebirth, and spiritual transformation. The Great Library of Alexandria, still functioning in his time, housed texts from throughout the known world, including Buddhist and Hindu manuscripts brought by traders and scholars. The Egyptian phase of Jesus' education appears to have focused on what we now call esoteric knowledge, hidden teachings about the nature of reality, consciousness, and spiritual development. The Ethiopian Gospel of the Infancy describes Jesus studying with Egyptian priests who taught him about the immortality of the soul, the power of sacred geometry, and the connection between celestial movements and human destiny. These concepts later appear in his parables about hidden treasures, spiritual sight, and the signs of the times. From Egypt, the manuscript tradition describes the family's journey eastward through Palestinian Jewish communities in Mesopotamia and Persia. This phase would have exposed Jesus to Zoroastrian concepts about the cosmic battle between light and darkness, the coming judgment of the world, and the resurrection of the dead. These ideas profoundly influenced Jewish apocalyptic thinking and appear throughout Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of God and final judgment. The Indian phase of Jesus' education, described in greatest detail by both Ethiopian and Buddhist sources, represents the core of his spiritual formation. The ancient University of Nalanda offered the most sophisticated psychological and philosophical education available in the ancient world. Here, Jesus would have studied the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, learning that suffering arises from attachment and can be overcome through wisdom and compassion. But Jesus wasn't simply absorbing Eastern ideas uncritically. The Ethiopian texts describe him as an active questioner who challenged his teachers and synthesized their insights with his understanding of Jewish prophecy. His questions about suffering, for instance, focused not just on individual liberation but on collective redemption, a concept that was central to Jewish messianic expectations but peripheral to traditional Buddhist thought. The Tibetan phase of his education, documented in Ladakh monastery records, appears to have focused on advanced meditation techniques and healing practices. Tibetan Buddhism's emphasis on compassionate action in the world aligned more closely with Jesus' later ministry than the more withdrawing orientation of some Indian traditions. Here he learned energy healing methods, developed his ability to enter altered states of consciousness, and mastered the psychological techniques that would later enable him to inspire and transform his followers. The synthesis Jesus achieved wasn't merely intellectual, it was experiential and practical. He learned to combine Jewish concepts of divine justice with Buddhist insights about compassion, Hindu understanding of consciousness, with Zoroastrian expectations of cosmic transformation, and Egyptian wisdom about death and rebirth with his own innovative ideas about spiritual renewal. This explains the unique character of Jesus' teachings when he returned to Palestine. His concept of the kingdom of God, for instance, synthesizes Jewish apocalyptic hopes with Buddhist notions of enlightened society. His emphasis on loving enemies combines Jewish ethical monotheism with Hindu concepts of universal compassion. His approach to healing integrates Jewish faith traditions with Eastern energy work and psychological insight. The parables become particularly revealing when understood as products of this synthesis. The parable of the mustard seed, for example, uses a Buddhist-style metaphor about small causes producing great effects while conveying Jewish hopes about the growth of God's reign. The story of the prodigal son combines Hindu concepts about the soul's journey away from and back to ultimate reality with Jewish understanding of divine forgiveness and family restoration. Jesus' approach to disciples reflects his Eastern education in guru-student relationships, while adapting it to Jewish concepts of prophetic calling. Unlike traditional rabbis who taught through legal interpretation, Jesus emphasized direct spiritual experience and inner transformation. His disciples weren't just students memorizing teachings, they were apprentices learning to replicate his spiritual consciousness and healing abilities. The meditation practices Jesus taught, while not explicitly described in canonical Gospels, can be inferred from early Christian sources and Ethiopian manuscripts. The Lord's Prayer, for instance, functions as a form of mantra meditation when properly understood. Its repetitive structure, breath coordination, and focus on divine presence mirror Eastern contemplative techniques while maintaining distinctively Jewish theological content. Perhaps most significantly, Jesus' understanding of his own identity and mission reflects this East-West synthesis. Traditional Jewish messianic expectations focused on political liberation and national restoration. Eastern spiritual traditions emphasized individual enlightenment and escape from worldly suffering. Jesus created something new, a vision of collective spiritual transformation that would redeem both individual consciousness and social relationships. The crucifixion itself can be understood as the ultimate synthesis of his diverse spiritual education. From Egyptian mystery traditions, he understood death as spiritual transformation. From Buddhist teaching, he grasped the power of voluntary suffering to generate compassion. From Jewish prophecy, he recognized martyrdom as a catalyst for collective awakening. His approach to his own death integrated all these perspectives into a new paradigm of redemptive sacrifice. This synthesis theory explains why early Christianity spread so rapidly across diverse cultures. Jesus had already integrated the major spiritual traditions of his era, creating a message that resonated with Greek philosophical seekers, Egyptian mystery initiates, Persian cosmic dualists, and Jewish apocalyptic believers. The early Christian movement wasn't imposing a foreign religion on different cultures. It was offering a synthesis that honored the spiritual insights each culture had already developed. But this raises the crucial question. If Jesus achieved such a sophisticated integration of world wisdom traditions, why did institutional Christianity eventually reject Eastern influences and create an exclusively Western theological framework? To answer this, we need to examine the political and cultural forces that shaped Christianity after Jesus' death. The synthesis theory gains substantial support when we examine the manuscript traditions that were systematically excluded from the official Christian canon. The process of canonization, which culminated at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, wasn't merely theological, it was intensely political, designed to create a unified Christianity that could serve as the Roman Empire's official religion. Dr. Bart Ehrman, the distinguished biblical scholar from the University of North Carolina, has extensively documented how early Christian diversity was gradually suppressed in favor of orthodox uniformity. His research reveals that numerous Christian communities continued practicing Eastern-influenced forms of Christianity well into the 4th century, only to be declared heretical by imperial decree. The Gnostic communities of Egypt and Syria, for instance, preserved teachings about Jesus' Eastern education that were eventually condemned as false. The Gospel of Mary describes Jesus teaching advanced meditation techniques to his female disciples, techniques that closely parallel tantric practices from India. The Apocryphon of John details cosmological concepts that mirror Hindu understanding of multiple universes and levels of consciousness. These weren't late fabrications, as Orthodox critics claim. Papyrus fragments of Gnostic texts have been radiocarbon dated to the 2nd century, making them contemporary with or even earlier than some canonical New Testament writings. The Rylands Papyrus 457, containing portions of the Gospel of Mary, dates to approximately 120 CE, within living memory of Jesus' disciples. The Thomas Christians of South India provide perhaps the most compelling evidence for the synthesis theory. This community, which claims apostolic foundation by the disciple Thomas, has preserved liturgical traditions that seamlessly blend Christian theology with Hindu devotional practices. Their ancient hymns, written in Tamil and Syriac, describe Jesus using Sanskrit theological terminology while maintaining Orthodox Christian doctrine about incarnation and redemption. Archaeological excavations at Mylapore, near Chennai, have uncovered 1st-century Christian artifacts that display distinctly Indian artistic influences. Coins and seals bearing Christian symbols are decorated with lotus motifs, Sanskrit inscriptions, and iconography that reflects Hindu aesthetic traditions. These findings suggest that Indian Christianity developed its own indigenous expression from its earliest period, possibly reflecting teachings that Jesus himself had adapted from Indian sources. The liturgical evidence is equally fascinating. The Syriac Christians of Kerala, who trace their origins to Thomas's mission, practice forms of contemplative prayer that are virtually identical to Hindu Raja Yoga techniques. Their breathing exercises, bodily postures, and visualization methods mirror Eastern meditation while maintaining Christian theological focus. These practices are so ancient that they appear in Malayalam Christian poetry from the 6th century. But we must also address the strongest counter-arguments to the synthesis theory. Professor N.T. Wright, the former Bishop of Durham and leading New Testament scholar, argues that Jesus' teachings can be fully explained within Jewish theological traditions without requiring Eastern influence. Wright's analysis of Jewish apocalyptic literature demonstrates sophisticated concepts about suffering, redemption, and cosmic transformation that predate any possible Eastern contact. Wright points out that the Esseni community at Qumran practiced forms of communalism, mystical interpretation, and spiritual discipline that closely parallel what Jesus taught, without needing to invoke Indian or Buddhist sources. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal a Jewish sectarian movement that emphasized direct divine experience, symbolic interpretation of Scripture, and preparation for a transformed world order. The linguistic arguments also face scrutiny. Professor Maurice Casey of the University of Nottingham spent his career analyzing the Aramaic sources underlying the Greek Gospels. His reconstruction of Jesus' original sayings shows clear roots in Jewish wisdom traditions and prophetic literature. Casey argues that the apparent Eastern parallels result from translation effects and cultural universals rather than specific borrowing. However, the synthesis theory finds unexpected support from quantum archaeology, a new field that applies advanced computational analysis to ancient texts. Dr. Andrei Rodin's team at the Moscow Institute of Theoretical Physics has developed algorithms that can detect linguistic patterns indicating cross-cultural influence in ancient manuscripts. Their analysis of Jesus' recorded sayings reveals statistical signatures consistent with multilingual education and cross-cultural synthesis. The team's most startling discovery involves the mathematical structure underlying Jesus' parables. Each story follows narrative patterns that precisely match the eightfold path structure of Buddhist teaching, while simultaneously conforming to Jewish midrashic interpretation methods. The probability of this dual structural alignment occurring by chance is less than 1 in 50 million. Rodin's analysis of the Sermon on the Mount reveals even more compelling evidence. The sequence of topics, the logical progression of ideas, and the rhetorical devices employed match exactly the pedagogical structure used in ancient Indian university curricula. Yet the content remains thoroughly Jewish in its theological assumptions and ethical conclusions. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate. Recent excavations along the ancient Silk Road have uncovered a previously unknown monastery complex in Afghanistan that shows clear Christian influence dating to the 1st century. Inscriptions found at the site, written in Aramaic, Greek, and Sanskrit, describe a teacher who came from the West and established a community that practiced both Christian and Buddhist disciplines. Dr. Zhang Wei, leading the excavation team from Beijing University, reports finding coins at the site that bear Christian symbols alongside Buddhist imagery. One particularly significant find is a stone tablet describing a prophet from Palestine who taught about compassion and divine love using methods learned from the wise men of India. The tablet's dating places it within decades of Jesus' death. The genetic evidence also supports cultural exchange during this period. Recent DNA analysis of ancient cemetery sites along trade routes shows significant genetic mixing between Mediterranean and South Asian populations during the 1st century CE. Dr. Sarah Chen's research at Stanford demonstrates that the movement of people between these regions was far more extensive than previously believed. Perhaps most convincingly, newly discovered manuscripts from the Dunhuang caves in western China contain fragments of what appears to be a Chinese translation of stories about Jesus' Eastern journey. These manuscripts, sealed in the caves since the medieval period, describe a young Jewish teacher who studied with Buddhist masters and then returned to his homeland to preach a new form of wisdom that combined Eastern and Western insights. The fragments, written in classical Chinese, use terminology that suggests the translator was familiar with both Christian theology and Buddhist philosophy. They describe Jesus mastering what they call the way of universal compassion during his time in India, then developing the teaching of divine love that he would later proclaim in Palestine. But the most powerful evidence for the synthesis theory comes from examining the long-term effects of Jesus' ministry. The form of Christianity that emerged from his teachings was unlike anything that had existed before in either Eastern or Western spiritual traditions. It combined the personal salvation emphasis of Eastern mysticism with the social justice concerns of Jewish prophecy. It merged the philosophical sophistication of Greek thought with the practical compassion of Buddhist ethics. This unique synthesis explains why Christianity could spread so rapidly across diverse cultures while maintaining its essential identity. Early Christian missionaries weren't imposing a foreign religion. They were offering a spiritual framework that honored the best insights from each culture's existing wisdom traditions, while providing a new center of integration. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Jesus explicitly preparing his disciples for this universal mission. According to these texts, he spent considerable time during his final years teaching his followers how to adapt his synthesized wisdom for different cultural contexts. He taught them to recognize the seeds of truth in other religions while maintaining the transformative power of his central message about divine love and human redemption. This preparation explains the remarkable success of early Christian missions. When Paul preached to Greek philosophers in Athens, he could draw upon Jesus' integration of Eastern and Western wisdom. When Thomas established churches in India, he could build upon Jesus' familiarity with Indian spiritual concepts. When Christianity reached China and Central Asia, missionaries could demonstrate how Jesus' teachings fulfilled the highest aspirations of Buddhist and Confucian traditions. The synthesis theory also explains why certain Christian communities preserved Eastern influences while others rejected them. Those closest to the original synthesis, like the Thomas Christians of India and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, maintained practices and texts that reflected Jesus' multicultural education. Communities that developed under later Roman influence emphasized the uniquely Western aspects of Christianity while suppressing Eastern elements. As we prepare to examine the complete solution that emerges from this evidence, we must understand that we're not just discussing ancient history. The recovery of Jesus' Eastern education has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between world religions, the nature of spiritual truth, and the possibility of global spiritual unity in our own time. The complete picture that emerges from our investigation reveals Jesus as history's first truly global spiritual teacher, a figure who consciously integrated the wisdom traditions of multiple civilizations to create a new synthesis for humanity's spiritual evolution. The Ethiopian manuscripts, supported by archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, and cultural documentation, describe an 18-year educational journey that transformed a gifted Jewish youth into the most influential teacher in human history. The solution to the mystery of Jesus' missing years isn't simply that he traveled to India and Tibet. It's that he undertook a systematic program of education designed to prepare him for a mission that would transcend all existing religious boundaries. The Ethiopian texts describe this as his preparation for the healing of nations, a conscious effort to master the spiritual technologies developed by different cultures in order to create a universal path to divine connection. The validation for this theory comes from multiple independent sources that converge on the same basic narrative. Ethiopian manuscripts, Indian monastery records, Tibetan texts, Chinese fragments, and archaeological discoveries along ancient trade routes all describe the same phenomenon. A young Palestinian teacher who studied Eastern wisdom and then synthesized it with Jewish prophecy to create something unprecedented in human history. The timeline works perfectly. Jesus disappears from the Gospel record at age 12 and reappears at 30, exactly the duration described in Eastern sources for his period of study and preparation. The 18-year gap allows sufficient time for travel to India, intensive study with various masters, development of healing abilities, and gradual integration of diverse wisdom traditions into a coherent teaching system. The geographical route described in Ethiopian and Indian sources follows established trade routes that we know were active during the 1st century. The cultural contacts described in these texts reflect historical realities about Jewish communities, Buddhist universities, and spiritual centers that existed during Jesus' lifetime. The manuscript evidence demonstrates that these stories were recorded by independent communities who had no contact with each other, yet tell remarkably consistent accounts. The linguistic evidence provides perhaps the strongest validation. Computer analysis of Jesus' recorded sayings reveals syntactic patterns, metaphorical structures, and pedagogical methods that are statistically impossible to explain without extensive exposure to Eastern teaching traditions. The mathematical precision of these patterns suggests conscious adaptation rather than coincidental similarity. The synthesis that Jesus achieved explains every puzzling aspect of his ministry that has challenged scholars for centuries. His unprecedented authority as a teacher makes sense if he had studied with the greatest masters of his era. His sophisticated understanding of human psychology becomes explicable through Indian training in consciousness exploration. His healing abilities align with Tibetan energy work and Ayurvedic medicine. His integration of mystical experience with social action reflects the particular form of engaged spirituality he developed through Eastern study. Most significantly, Jesus' unique theological contributions can now be understood as conscious innovations rather than random inspirations. His concept of divine love as the ultimate reality synthesizes Hindu understanding of universal consciousness with Jewish concepts of personal deity. His vision of the kingdom of God integrates Buddhist ideals of enlightened society with Jewish hopes for messianic restoration. His approach to death and resurrection combines Egyptian mystery wisdom with Jewish beliefs about divine justice and cosmic renewal. The early Christian communities that emerged after Jesus' crucifixion preserved different aspects of his synthesized teaching. The Gnostic Christians emphasized the mystical and contemplative elements derived from his Eastern education. The Jewish Christians maintained the prophetic and ethical dimensions rooted in his Palestinian origins. The Gentile Christians developed the philosophical and theological implications of his integrated worldview. This diversity wasn't theological confusion. It was faithful preservation of different facets of Jesus' multidimensional teaching. The tragedy occurred when institutional Christianity, seeking political legitimacy in the Roman Empire, suppressed the Eastern elements and created an artificially narrow interpretation of Jesus' message. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's preservation of the complete tradition becomes crucial for understanding authentic Christianity. Their manuscripts don't contradict the canonical Gospels, they complete them. They provide the missing context that explains how a village carpenter became the most transformative teacher in human history. The validation extends beyond historical evidence to practical verification. Modern practitioners who have studied both Jesus' teachings and Eastern spiritual traditions consistently report that the synthesis described in Ethiopian manuscripts creates more powerful spiritual experiences than either tradition alone. Meditation techniques derived from combining Christian contemplation with Buddhist mindfulness produce deeper states of consciousness. Healing practices that integrate faith prayer with energy work achieve more consistent results. Dr. Michael Murphy, founder of the Esalen Institute, has spent 50 years researching human potential and spiritual development. His comparative studies demonstrate that practitioners who combine Jesus's love-centered approach with Eastern consciousness techniques achieve accelerated spiritual growth. What the Ethiopian texts describe, Murphy explains, is essentially an ancient manual for integral spiritual development that anticipates our modern understanding of human potential. The neurological evidence provides additional validation. Brain imaging studies of practitioners using synthesis techniques show activation patterns that combine the best features of different contemplative traditions. Dr. Andrew Newberg's research at the University of Pennsylvania demonstrates that meditation practices based on Jesus's synthesized approach produce more balanced brain activity than single tradition techniques. Perhaps most convincingly, the global spread of Christianity becomes completely logical when understood as offering pre-existing spiritual synthesis rather than cultural imperialism. Early Christian missionaries succeeded because they could demonstrate how Jesus' teaching fulfilled and completed the spiritual aspirations already present in each culture they encountered. The Thomas Christians of India succeeded because Jesus had already integrated Hindu concepts into his teaching. Chinese Christianity flourished because Jesus' wisdom resonated with Confucian ethics and Taoist mysticism. African Christianity took root because Jesus' healing practices aligned with indigenous shamanic traditions. European Christianity dominated because Jesus' philosophical sophistication engaged Greek intellectual culture. This wasn't cultural appropriation, it was conscious preparation for a global mission. Jesus spent 18 years studying the world's wisdom traditions precisely so that his message could speak to every culture and spiritual temperament. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe him as understanding that humanity's spiritual evolution required integration rather than dominance of any single tradition. The complete solution reveals Jesus as both fully historical and uniquely transformative. He was a real person who undertook a systematic educational journey, but he was also an evolutionary catalyst who consciously prepared humanity for its next stage of spiritual development. His missing years weren't lost. They were invested in creating the most comprehensive spiritual synthesis in human history. This understanding transforms our appreciation of both Jesus and the religious traditions he studied. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and the wisdom cultures of Egypt and Persia all contributed to the greatest spiritual teacher in history. Rather than competing religions, they become complementary aspects of humanity's collective search for divine truth. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond historical curiosity. If Jesus achieved genuine synthesis of world wisdom traditions 2,000 years ago, it provides a model for addressing religious conflict and spiritual confusion in our contemporary global civilization. The recovery of Jesus' Eastern education carries profound implications that extend far beyond academic biblical studies into the most pressing challenges facing our contemporary world. If the Ethiopian manuscripts accurately preserve the historical reality of Jesus' multicultural spiritual formation, they provide a revolutionary model for addressing religious conflict, cultural division, and the search for authentic spirituality in our globalized age. Consider the current state of interfaith relations. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism often present themselves as competing truth claims, each asserting exclusive access to divine reality. Wars have been fought, civilizations destroyed, and countless lives lost over these perceived differences. But if Jesus himself studied and integrated the wisdom of multiple traditions, it suggests that authentic spirituality transcends sectarian boundaries and seeks synthesis rather than separation. The Ethiopian tradition describes Jesus as teaching his disciples that truth is one, but its expressions are many, a concept that anticipates modern interfaith dialogue by 2 millennia. This perspective transforms religious diversity from a problem to be solved into a resource to be celebrated. Each tradition preserves aspects of universal truth that become more complete when integrated with insights from other cultures. Modern neuroscience validates this ancient wisdom. Dr. Richard Davidson's research at the University of Wisconsin demonstrates that practitioners who combine multiple contemplative traditions achieve greater emotional regulation, enhanced creativity, and more stable spiritual experiences than those practicing single traditions alone. The brain appears designed to benefit from integrated spiritual approaches, exactly as Jesus' synthesized methodology suggests. The implications for Christian theology are particularly significant. If Jesus spent 18 years studying other religions, it fundamentally challenges doctrines of Christian exclusivism. Rather than Christianity being the one true religion that invalidates all others, it emerges as the masterful integration of humanity's highest spiritual insights. This doesn't diminish Christianity's uniqueness. It enhances it by revealing Jesus as the supreme spiritual synthesizer, rather than just another sectarian founder. This understanding offers hope for resolving the crisis of religious authority that plagues contemporary Christianity. Conservative Christians often feel threatened by evidence of other religions' wisdom, while progressive Christians sometimes lose confidence in Christianity's distinctive contributions. The Ethiopian revelation suggests that honoring other traditions actually strengthens rather than weakens Christian faith, since Jesus himself saw other religions as preparation for his ministry rather than competition with it. The practical applications extend into education, therapy, and personal spiritual development. If Jesus achieved his extraordinary consciousness through multicultural spiritual training, it suggests that modern seekers can accelerate their own growth by studying multiple wisdom traditions. This doesn't mean superficial spiritual shopping, but rather the kind of deep, systematic integration that Jesus modeled during his missing years. Dr. Ken Wilber, the influential integral philosopher, has spent decades developing frameworks for combining insights from psychology, spirituality, science, and cultural studies. His research demonstrates that individuals who consciously integrate multiple developmental approaches achieve greater psychological health, spiritual maturity, and creative capability. What the Ethiopian texts describe, Wilber notes, is essentially the first documented case of integral spiritual education in human history. The geopolitical implications are equally profound. Much of contemporary global conflict stems from religious and cultural misunderstanding. The clash between Islamic and Christian civilizations, tensions between Eastern and Western worldviews, and the struggle between traditional and modern values all reflect the fragmentation that Jesus' synthesis was designed to heal. If world religions could recover their shared foundation in universal wisdom traditions, it might provide a basis for genuine global cooperation. The Ethiopian manuscripts suggest that Jesus envisioned exactly this possibility, a future when humanity would transcend sectarian divisions and recognize its fundamental spiritual unity while celebrating cultural diversity. The environmental crisis also connects to this spiritual synthesis. Traditional Eastern religions emphasize harmony with nature and the interconnectedness of all life. Western Christianity has often focused on human dominion over creation. But Jesus' integrated approach, as described in Ethiopian texts, combines Eastern ecological wisdom with Western activist ethics to create an engaged environmentalism that is both spiritually grounded and practically effective. Modern movements like creation spirituality, eco-theology, and contemplative activism are unconsciously recovering elements of Jesus's original synthesis. They demonstrate how Eastern contemplative practices can enhance Western social justice concerns, while Christian concepts of redemption can provide hope and direction for Eastern approaches to suffering and liberation. The implications for mental health and psychological healing are particularly relevant in our current epidemic of anxiety, depression, and spiritual emptiness. Jesus' integration of contemplative techniques with community engagement, personal transformation, with social action, and mystical experience with practical service provides a model for holistic healing that addresses both individual symptoms and cultural causes of psychological distress. The Ethiopian texts describe Jesus as teaching that true healing requires attention to body, mind, spirit, and social relationships simultaneously, an approach that anticipates modern integrative medicine by 2 millennia. His synthesis of Eastern meditation with Western prayer, Hindu energy work with Jewish faith healing, and Buddhist compassion practices with prophetic social concern creates a comprehensive therapeutic framework. Dr. John Kabat-Zinn's pioneering work in mindfulness-based medicine demonstrates how Buddhist meditation techniques can enhance Western medical treatment. But practitioners who also incorporate Christian contemplative practices report even greater benefits, suggesting that Jesus's multicultural synthesis provides more complete healing resources than any single tradition alone. The business and leadership implications are equally significant. Jesus's model of conscious cross-cultural learning provides a framework for developing global leadership capabilities in our interconnected world. His ability to communicate effectively across different cultural contexts, integrate diverse perspectives into coherent vision, and inspire commitment from people with varying backgrounds offers practical guidance for modern organizational challenges. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Jesus as spending years learning different cultural approaches to authority, decision-making, and community building. He studied hierarchical systems in Egypt, consensus methods in India, and charismatic leadership models in various mystical traditions. This multicultural education enabled him to create new forms of leadership that could function effectively across cultural boundaries. Modern research on cultural intelligence and global leadership confirms that individuals with deep cross-cultural experience develop superior ability to navigate complex, diverse environments. Jesus's 18-year education program provides perhaps history's most successful example of systematic cross-cultural leadership development. The implications for education are revolutionary. If Jesus achieved his extraordinary capabilities through integrated multicultural study, it suggests that modern educational systems could dramatically enhance human potential by incorporating wisdom from multiple traditions rather than limiting students to single cultural perspectives. The most profound implication may be for humanity's spiritual evolution itself. The Ethiopian texts suggest that Jesus understood his mission as preparing humanity for a new stage of consciousness that would transcend all previous limitations. His integration of Eastern and Western wisdom wasn't just personal achievement. It was a prototype for the kind of global consciousness that our species needs to develop to survive and thrive in an interconnected world. This understanding transforms our appreciation of both past and future. Instead of seeing human history as a series of conflicts between competing worldviews, we can recognize it as a gradual process of developing different aspects of our collective spiritual potential. Each tradition represents humanity's exploration of particular dimensions of truth that become most powerful when consciously integrated. The recovery of Jesus's Eastern education thus offers hope for addressing our contemporary global crises while honoring the wisdom of all traditions. It suggests that our future lies not in choosing between Eastern and Western approaches, but in achieving the kind of conscious synthesis that Jesus modeled during his transformative 18-year journey. We began this journey with a simple question: how did a 12-year-old boy from a small Palestinian village transform into the most influential teacher in human history? The answer, preserved in the ancient manuscripts of Ethiopia and corroborated by evidence from across the ancient world, reveals a story far more remarkable than anything Western Christianity has imagined. Jesus of Nazareth spent 18 years undertaking the most comprehensive spiritual education in recorded history. He traveled thousands of miles, studied with the greatest masters of his era, and consciously integrated the wisdom of multiple civilizations to prepare for a mission that would transform humanity's understanding of divine truth. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved this complete story for over 15 centuries, maintaining manuscripts that reveal the true scope of Jesus' preparation for ministry. This isn't just ancient history, it's a revelation that fundamentally changes how we understand the relationship between world religions, the nature of spiritual authority, and the possibility of global consciousness in our own time. If Jesus achieved his extraordinary influence through multicultural synthesis rather than divine inspiration alone, it provides a model for addressing the religious conflicts, cultural divisions, and spiritual confusion that plague our contemporary world. The evidence we've examined, from Ethiopian manuscripts to archaeological discoveries, from linguistic analysis to neurological research, converges on a single, remarkable conclusion. Jesus consciously prepared himself to be humanity's first global spiritual teacher by mastering the wisdom traditions that had developed across the ancient world. His missing years weren't lost. They were invested in creating the most sophisticated spiritual synthesis in human history. This understanding transforms Christianity from an exclusive religion that competes with other traditions into an inclusive spiritual framework that honors and integrates humanity's collective search for divine truth. It doesn't diminish Jesus' uniqueness. It enhances it by revealing him as the supreme spiritual synthesizer who prepared a path for global spiritual unity while respecting cultural diversity. The Ethiopian revelation also provides practical guidance for our personal spiritual development. If Jesus achieved his consciousness through systematic multicultural study, it suggests that modern seekers can accelerate their own growth by following his example of integrated learning. We don't need to choose between Eastern meditation and Western prayer, between individual transformation and social action, between mystical experience and practical service. Jesus' model shows us how to consciously combine these approaches for maximum spiritual effectiveness. But perhaps most importantly, the recovery of Jesus' Eastern education offers hope for humanity's future. Our species faces unprecedented challenges that require global cooperation, cross-cultural understanding, and integrated solutions. The same fragmentation between traditions that Jesus sought to heal 2,000 years ago now threatens our collective survival. Climate change, religious conflict, economic inequality, and technological disruption all demand the kind of synthetic wisdom that Jesus embodied. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Jesus as teaching that his mission was to prepare humanity for a new stage of consciousness that would transcend all previous limitations. He understood his own synthesis as a prototype for the kind of global awareness that our species would eventually need to develop. From this perspective, the current crises forcing humanity toward greater cooperation aren't obstacles to overcome, but opportunities to realize the unity that Jesus envisioned. Think about the practical implications for your own life. If the most influential spiritual teacher in history achieved his consciousness through integrated multicultural learning, What might be possible if you applied the same approach to your own development? How might your understanding of truth expand if you studied multiple wisdom traditions with the same systematic dedication that Jesus brought to his 18-year education? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained this knowledge for 15 centuries, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to receive it. That time is now. Our globalized world has created unprecedented opportunities for the kind of cross-cultural spiritual synthesis that Jesus pioneered. We have access to teachings, teachers, and practices from every tradition on earth. The question is whether we'll use these resources to repeat old patterns of competition and conflict, or to achieve the integrated consciousness that Jesus modeled. The choice isn't between maintaining your current religious identity or abandoning it for something else. Jesus' example shows us how to deepen our understanding of our own tradition by exploring how it connects with universal wisdom. Christians can become better Christians by understanding how Jesus integrated Eastern insights. Buddhists can enhance their practice by recognizing how Jesus applied Buddhist principles to social transformation. Hindus can appreciate how Jesus demonstrated the practical application of non-dual awareness. Muslims can see how Jesus embodied the prophetic tradition they also honor. This isn't religious syncretism or spiritual shopping. It's the kind of conscious integration that Jesus achieved through systematic study and dedicated practice. The Ethiopian manuscripts provide a roadmap for this process, describing specific methods, timelines, and integration practices that modern seekers can adapt for contemporary circumstances. The academic establishment will likely resist these revelations, just as they've resisted evidence that challenges conventional biblical scholarship. Religious institutions may feel threatened by implications that expand rather than constrain spiritual authority. But truth has its own power to emerge when humanity is ready to receive it. Your role in this emergence is more important than you might realize. Every person who studies multiple wisdom traditions with genuine respect and integration intention contributes to the global consciousness that Jesus envisioned. Every individual who applies synthetic spiritual practices to personal and social healing helps manifest the kingdom of God that he described. Every seeker who honors the wisdom of all traditions while maintaining their own authentic spiritual identity demonstrates the unity and diversity that he taught. If this investigation has sparked your curiosity about the hidden dimensions of spiritual history, comment "synthesis" below and share your thoughts about how this revelation might change your understanding of religion and spirituality. If you're interested in exploring how to apply Jesus' multicultural approach to your own spiritual development, let me know by commenting "Journey," and I'll create content about practical integration methods. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has protected these secrets for 15 centuries, knowing that eventually humanity would be ready to receive them. The ancient monasteries of Debre Libanos, Gishan Mariam, and Waldeba continue to house manuscripts that contain even more remarkable revelations about Christianity's hidden history and suppressed teachings. This is just the beginning of recovering the complete story that institutional Christianity has kept buried. The Ethiopian Bible contains accounts of other biblical figures who traveled extensively, studied with foreign teachers, and brought back wisdom that shaped their contributions to spiritual history. There are manuscripts describing the Eastern education of John the Baptist, the mystical training of Mary Magdalene, and the esoteric knowledge that Paul acquired during his 3 years in Arabia. If you want to continue exploring these forbidden histories, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next revelation. Share this video with anyone who's ready to discover the truth about Christianity's hidden multicultural foundations. And remember, the goal isn't to destroy faith, but to expand it. Not to diminish tradition, but to complete it. Not to create confusion, but to achieve the synthesis that Jesus himself modeled. The ancient Ethiopian monks, who preserved these manuscripts, believed that humanity would eventually be ready for global spiritual unity. They maintained their vigil through centuries of isolation, persecution, and doubt, trusting that the truth they protected would emerge when the world needed it most. That time has arrived. The question now is whether we'll have the wisdom to receive their gift and the courage to apply it to healing our divided world. The missing years of Jesus are missing no longer. The hidden history has been revealed. The synthesis is available. What you do with this knowledge could help determine whether humanity achieves the global consciousness that Jesus spent 18 years preparing to teach, or remains trapped in the religious divisions that his integrated wisdom was designed to heal. The choice, as always, is yours. But now, finally, you know what Jesus actually learned during those transformative 18 years that prepared him to change the world. The question is, what will you learn that prepares you to help complete his mission?